Welcome back to the Flex Podcast. I'm Blake Liddell, and I'm joined again by my good friend, Nick DeMeo.
Hello.
In this show, we'll review our predictions from last week's episode. We'll then focus on running backs you should target to bolster your team, especially after the injuries we've had over the past few weeks. And finally, we'll wrap up with this week's deep sleepers. Nick, first of all, it's good to have you back on.
Thank you.
I think you heard that, I kind of put you on blast about hiding.
They were terrible. They were terrible deep sleepers. They didn't wake up last week either. So I think we can bury the hatchet on both Kari Lee and Jake Stoneburner. So hopefully you didn't take that advice.
Yeah, well, and tight ends are so hard to predict anyway, so it was pretty brave of you to pick two that week, especially ones that, weren't necessarily in the limelight. I mean, the ones who start are hard enough to predict.
Right.
But no, I was going to give you a real hard time, but after this past week, your Amendola pick really paid off.
Well, I figured with the Jets lining up Revis against Edelman, I know Brady likes those kind of... He's had guys like Welker, he's had Edelman, and Amendola kind of fits that mold of the smaller receiver that is better in the intermediate routes. Brady likes to eat those routes up, and I figured with Revis paying attention to Edelman, that would open up some things for Amendola. Going forward, I don't know how viable of a fantasy option he is, but LaFell seems to have stone hands coming back, and Brady likes to spread the ball around. So if you picked up Amendola, I don't think there's any rush to get rid of him.
Well, that was my worry when you picked Amendola. I was kind of like, well, LaFell's coming back, and he was injured for so long, or on the injured or the pup list for so long that I figured he'd have some sort of rust. But yeah, he did have a whole bunch of drops. Have you seen that Vine video they had of LaFell?
Oh gosh, I don't think I've seen that one.
I'll have to send it to you, and I'll put it in the description of the YouTube video as well. But it was a video of this guy rolling around, basically one of those rolling trash cans, and somebody else throwing a football at it, and it had a LaFell jersey on it. It was like, oh yeah, here's LaFell during this past week's game, and it's just like you see a football going at a trash can, just like thump.
I know that the New England fans are very frustrated. Their team is 0-6, and they haven't won a Super Bowl in about 25 years. So.
I think they'll be all right this year.
Yeah, I think they'll survive. But yeah, I mean, I think Amendola, he's a guy that they signed him to a pretty decent contract a couple of years ago, and I know he's been injured, but if he can stay healthy, it's tough to kind of break that rapport that Brady has with Edelman, but I think Amendola could serve to be a pretty decent, flex receiver going forward.
That's a pretty big if, though. He's been injured basically like every single season, and half the season at that.
Yeah, made of glass.
Yeah, he's kind of the Bradford of wide receivers as well, but that was definitely the bright spot. I picked Chris Hogan out of Buffalo. He didn't do too badly. He had 5 in standard, 11 PPR. Not horrible, but really Woods was the guy that got the benefit of the injuries that I was expecting out of that. I also picked Chris Conley. I said if Macklin was out, and he had a pretty decent game. He had 12 in standard, 18 in PPR. Nothing to shake your head at.
Not at all.
And I actually like Chris Conley going forward. Macklin is back off the concussion protocol, but I think just with the talent, Conley might have a spot in that offense. So you may not want to get rid of him immediately.
I agree, because I think Albert Wilson kind of projects similar to Macklin. I think they have a similar skill set, so I think Conley's a little more of a bigger receiver. Not huge, but I mean, he's a bigger target, a little more of a possession guy that he can be a go-to guy for Alex Smith. We know he doesn't like to go deep and stretch the field, so it's good to have those guys that can dominate the intermediate routes, and Conley showed a lot last week that he could do that and get into the end zone.
Definitely. Also, last week I mentioned Willie Snead. He did not have a great week. It wasn't one of my sleepers, but it was someone that I said, grab, and I thought he had a great matchup, but it just didn't pan out against Indy. I figured Cooks would have the tightest coverage with Vontae Davis on him, but I didn't see that game, but I did see Snead did not do well. The targets are there, so it's not someone again that I would really think about dropping if I picked him up for this week. But his production, it's been a little low, but I think that has more to do with New Orleans as a whole team than it does with Snead. I think there's a spot for him.
Yeah, their offense seems to be very inconsistent. I think Snead's a good guy to hold on to. Brandon Cooks is gobbling up a lot of targets, but he's not catching a lot of passes. And, being the best receiver with Colston out, I think they're putting Vontae Davis was watching Brandon Cooks, so I could see where Snead would have been a guy that could have had a big day, but, the Saints really found something with their ground game against the Colts, and I think that accounted for something like at least 3, maybe 4 touchdowns. I can't remember. I know Kyrie Robinson had 2, and Ingram had, I think, 1 or 2. So, when your ground game's going, there's no need to, put Breeze at harm's way, so just kind of pound the rock and go home happy. But, yeah, going forward, Cooks is really their only true receiving threat, meaning that he's going to draw the coverage, and Snead should continue to kind of get a lot of targets and be a monster in PPR.
Yeah, exactly. I also kind of mentioned Mark Sanchez last week, just as someone to keep your eye on in terms of, I don't think Bradford's doing anything special in Philly. So, I mean, there's a decent chance that Bradford gets pulled. That, with the depth at quarterback this year, though, I don't know if Sanchez is really someone that you'd, pick up by any means and stash. But again, just something to think about. If you do have Bradford, just have Mark Sanchez in the back of your mind. But again, there may be better quarterbacks on your waiver wire as well.
Well, and the thing to pay attention to with Sanchez in regards to Bradford is when the Rams traded Bradford to the Eagles, the stipulation was that if Bradford played, I believe it was something like 60% of the snaps, the offensive plays, that the Eagles would forfeit a 4th-round pick. And as we get closer to the halfway point of the season and beyond, if he really continues to struggle, Chip Kelly might want to pocket that 4th-rounder, and then he'll throw Sanchez out there for the rest of the year. So I think Sanchez is worth keeping an eye on until maybe about week 9, week 10. Bradford is still the guy, and I think Kelly's just going to ride him out. But Bradford's not getting any help from his receivers. They're dropping passes. I mean, Jordan Matthews has been a huge fantasy disappointment. But so as far as Sanchez goes, just keep your eye on that 60% line, and if Bradford if he's still the starter in week 10, 11, I think you can kind of put Sanchez behind you and just assume Bradford's going to finish the year.
Yeah, well, and to put something in perspective, you were talking about Matthews having all those drops, and that's Jordan Matthews, not Ryan Matthews.
Right.
To put that in perspective, he has had an injury of the past 3 weeks with his hand, so I mean that may be where some of those drops are coming from.
That. Mm-hmm.
He was actually dropped in one of my leagues, and I'm definitely looking at picking him up. He's not going to set the world on fire or anything. But, I think with the targets that he's been getting, even with all the drops, I think he's a good guy to have on your squad just on the bench for now until he proves otherwise. But
right. And just to correct myself, I stuck my foot in my mouth. It's the stipulation in the contract is if Bradford plays less than 50% of Philadelphia's offensive snaps for the rest of the year, the Eagles receive a 2016 4th-round pick from St. Louis. Inversely, if Bradford plays 50% or more of the snaps, the Eagles will receive no pick at all. So, again, as we near the halfway point, just something to keep your eye on.
And, also the contract, I believe, has him for just 1 year anyway. So,
yeah.
I mean, they could extend that, obviously, if he, again, sets the world on fire. But I don't really see that happening. But, who knows?
Yeah, he's not to derail the topic of conversation, but he's one of the bigger fantasy disappointments, that's for sure, as far as quarterbacks go.
Oh, yeah. I mean, going into this year, I was thinking Philly was going to set the world on fire with how great they looked on paper, but it just hasn't panned out. And I don't really know who to point the finger at, whether I guess Bradford's the one, but the running game hasn't been great outside of Matthews, but they're not giving him the carries. Murray's been okay over the past few games. I mean, it's just it's a bad situation, and I'm not really sure why.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are just so peculiar in that area, and I think it's just, this is Chip Kelly's 3rd year. He came in as this sort of offensive guru, this guy that would revolutionize the way offenses run, and for a couple of years, he really did look like he knew what he was doing, but he kind of jettisoned a lot of Philadelphia stalwarts, and he brought in his own guys. He's running his own offense, and I think the league is starting to adapt to what he's doing. And, it's just up to him to make the adjustments. But, having DeMarco Murray run east to west is not in his strong, that's not his strength. Asking Sam Bradford to run an offense that could, benefit from a guy like Mariota that could run the read option, which kind of lends itself to why, it's rumors were that Kelly wanted him so badly. I think Bradford's proven he's much more of a pocket quarterback, and any mobility he had might have been sapped when he got those 2 or 3 ACL injuries. So, I think maybe this is a humbling thing for Kelly. I think he kind of came in as this mad scientist / genius, and it's kind of blowing up in his face this year.
I mean, what he really looks like is the fantasy expert who thinks they know everything and is trying to just make all these really weird moves to try and get something going, and they just don't pan out. I mean, it's that type of thing. 'Cause
overthinking.
Yeah, and I mean, because looking at the roster, from last year and even more so the year before, if you compared it to this year, like you said, he's just gotten rid of so many people who were critical to the Eagles' success previously, and I mean he's
Mhm.
gotten rid of people who you may not have heard of as well. But I mean that roster has gone over some major changes.
Yeah, it's not a dumpster fire. They've got a lot of talent. It's just the talent isn't being utilized to the best of their abilities. And I thought we started to we're starting to see DeMarco Murray kind of run more north south. But don't forget their offensive line too. I know you guys talked about it a lot last week. That offensive line has had a ton of turnover as far as you had Evan Mathis going to Denver, who was a Pro Bowl, right guard that was just the best at his position for a long time. You have Jason Peters going down last week with a back injury. I mean, there's some shuffling on that line that has kind of put a lot of put Bradford at the mercy of the defense, and it's also not opened up a lot of running lanes for the running backs. So I don't know if they'll turn it around. They look like an 8-8 team, to be honest, which is not terrible, but I think they were projected to be maybe 11-5, 12-4, and take that division.
Yeah, I completely agree. Speaking of running lanes, let's get into this week's running back replacements. There have been a couple of major injuries. Jamal Charles, what was it, 2 weeks ago, and Foster this past week.
I'm a Foster owner, and
You were a Foster
he
owner.
is the Derrick Rose of the NFL. He is a guy that you bank on. He is. Well, for starters, I don't know if he'll ever come back from the Achilles injury, but I don't know the last time Foster played a full season. I don't know the last time he played 75% of a season. And to kind of delve into that, I went on to a couple of Texans sites just to kind of do a little more research, wondering why he is so injured so frequently. And there's a lot of conjecture that if you watched Hard Knocks this past season, they did the Texans, and they have Arian Foster training with his brother, and his brother kind of does these oddball training regimens that aren't quite in line with what the NFL does. They're very sort of, I don't want to, they kind of, I don't want to say they subvert a lot of the tried and true techniques, but they're very sort of out of their left field stuff. And a lot of fans are thinking, this is why he's getting injured. He's foregoing what's worked to try to kind of get this new age treatment from a guy that isn't really, an NFL certified trainer. And they're wondering if that might be why he's so fragile. But like I said, Achilles, who knows if he'll come back, but, he's going to be 30 years old. It stinks. I was banking on him to kind of help carry my running back load, and I should have just known that he's made of glass and at any point he'll shatter.
Well, and to go into that new age aspect of him, I mean, he's a vegan. He's never really been somebody who goes with the grain. Like he's a very against the grain type of guy. And his views of the media. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of where he's just a unique guy. And I mean, maybe you're right in terms of maybe that kind of led to, I guess, his injury proneness, if you want to say that.
Right. And yeah, he was an undrafted free agent. He was kind of an oddball guy at Tennessee. I mean, he was a good player, but yeah, it just, it is what it is. Unfortunately, an Achilles injury is really tough for a running back to come back from. I know a lot of guys have had Achilles injuries and come back, but they're typically linemen. And, that's just something that they can come back to a lot easier. A guy that relies on his agility and speed is going to suffer a lot more. So hopefully he can recover. It doesn't look good, but, Godspeed, Arian Foster. You gave me 3 good games, and then you vanished into the void.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Arian Foster is, he's been so good when he plays, and I feel like, especially this year, he was kind of like how Tom Brady was, where I know Brady was dealing with the suspension early on, but a lot of teams got Foster very late. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the expectation was he was going to pay off big, and he did for the games that he played. But
yeah, well, he was a guy that would win your league. I know I drafted him in, I believe, the 6th round, and I was kind of, he was that guy that I was thinking, this is because originally they thought he'd be out for the year after he, I know he tore his groin, and then it was week 2, then week 6, then week 4. So, I mean, it kind of bounced around, but, getting that value in the 6th round was something that was hard to pass up. And yeah, he came in, gave you 3 weeks where he scored over 20 points, and then he kind of just, I mean, he, in a game where they were getting blown out, he slipped, or I don't know what happened, but his leg gave out. He tore his Achilles, and that was the end of that. So, it stinks. I don't know next year. Again, I don't know if he's even going to come back. If he, I won't take him in the sixth. It'll have to be like the 10th or 11th next year. And even at that, it's a risk because, you don't know what he's going to give you when he comes back.
Well, I think if anyone can recover from an Achilles injury, I mean, again, it's very difficult, but if anyone can, I think Arian Foster can. I mean, he's kind of, how Adrian Peterson, I think, tore his ACL a couple of years ago, and then as soon as he came back, he set the world on fire again.
Right.
And I think Arian Foster is that type of back. I don't know. We will see. But
yeah,
for right now, as an Arian Foster owner, I mean, who do you target? Are you targeting more for trades, or are you targeting more on guys on the waiver wire?
The thing with Arian Foster is it's tough to replace his production anywhere. Whatever you do now, if you're an Arian Foster owner, the first thing you can do is not panic. I mean, it's hard not to panic because he was obviously your running back 1 or running back 2. So hopefully you drafted him later and you had a guy ahead of him. So for me, I have Adrian Peterson, and Arian Foster was my number 2. So, what I'm targeting now is the waiver wire is a desolate wasteland unless you're in like an 8-man league. So if you're in a 12-man league, the best you can find is a running back in a committee. So, I mean, you look at Houston immediately, you see who's going to take his place. I think it's going to be a mixture of Alfred Blue and Chris Polk. Neither of those guys really leave me confident. I don't want to plug one or the other into my lineup. I think of the two, Chris Polk has more upside just because we've seen what Alfred Blue can do. And it's, I mean, he might get you a couple points, but this is a Texans team that can't throw the ball, and Alfred Blue's not good enough to create running space. So I think Chris Polk is going to benefit because at least he can catch out of the backfield. So he might line up in that slot position that Foster used to and maybe get some of those targets. Elsewhere around the league, in Dallas, you've got another committee. You've got Jerry Jones coming out and saying Darren McFadden is a starter. He's another guy that's made of glass. So I don't know if I really want to jump one ship to the other or just to have it sink a week down the road. And Christine Michael seems like he was more hype than anything else, but he did carry the ball fairly well in a couple of instances last week. It's tough to really gauge these running backs because when they're in committees like this, there's no real rhythm to the way they carry the ball. You see maybe one series, you see a fraction of a series going to a guy. So what I did was I think if you have a viable running back on your bench, I had Doug Martin playing my flex, so I moved him up to my running back 3 or running back 2 slot, and then I just plugged a receiver into the flex. If you can, I think there's some buy low guys that might be out there that you could target. I know Jeremy Hill is one of them. He's a guy that hasn't in 3 games he's done all right. In 3 other games he's done abysmal. So you might find a sour Jeremy Hill owner. Same with Frank Gore and Carlos Hyde. Those are 2 guys that are bell cows on teams that haven't really hit their stride. I don't know if the 49ers will. You assume the Colts and Luck will find their way eventually. But yeah, I mean, when I lost Arian Foster, it was, you kind of just have to realize there's nothing you can really do to replace that that's not going to either cost you one of your other good players in a trade, or you're just going to have to kind of live with what you can get on the waiver wire. And I don't know if I speak for everyone, but at least for me, the waiver wire is pretty bare at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. Looking at, like you said about Blue and Polk, I definitely like Polk more in a PPR, but like you said, I don't really want any of these guys on my team.
Right.
If you're in full desperation mode, again, I'd go Polk. A lot of Arian Foster's success was catching passes out of the backfield this year, just because, Houston's been so far behind on like every single game they've played. Their defense isn't living up to expectations. Their passing game isn't great. Their running game outside of Foster hasn't been that good. But when you're that far down, I mean, you're not looking to run the ball anyway. So, again, if either of them have value, I'm going Polk as well. If you have somebody, like you said, Nick, that can kind of bump up from a flex and be okay, that you had to kind of plan for through the draft anyway. I like David Cobb a lot just because he's been injured. He's on Tennessee. I know they're in a running back by committee to the absolute letter of the law in terms of what that means. They kind of go with just whoever they want on any given play. But David Cobb had a lot of success in the preseason, and Weisenhunt had a quote where he was talking about how he would really prefer to have a bell cow back, and really out of the list of guys that they have at running back in Tennessee, I like Cobb the most to fulfill that type of role. We'll see how the injury pans out, but again, if you're looking for like a lottery ticket, I really like him.
Yeah, and back to your point about the two Houston running backs, I think people kind of lose in the details that Arian Foster carried the ball 63 times and only got 163 yards. So that's a 2.6 average. So I mean, his strength this year wasn't essentially running the football. His strength is as a receiver. He caught 22 passes for 227 yards. So I mean, Chris Polk isn't, if Chris Polk can come in and kind of, it's not going to be hard to replicate that 2.6 yards a carry. And that's what Alfred Blue is going to give you, but Alfred Blue can't catch out of the backfield. So, I agree in the sense that, Chris Polk's definitely got the higher upside in that offense, but that whole offense is terrible. I mean, if you're banking on one of those guys, Arian Foster and DeAndre Hopkins were the only guys to own on that team.
And that's still true.
Yeah,
I mean, even, for
exactly.
Foster Moore for Dynasty, if you think he's going to come back, and really Hopkins is the only one to own. Maybe the secondary wide receiver, but I think Hopkins can outplay any coverage.
Yeah, and you've got a couple of, you've got the Cecil Shorts and Nate Washingtons of the world that I think people are, kind of seeing the numbers and thinking they're better than they are. But I think that those guys are way too inconsistent to consider starting on a weekly basis. So, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. You can't replace Arian Foster. You just kind of hope to tread water. It's going to thin out anyone that had him. But again, there are owners, maybe if you can pick up C.J. Anderson for nothing. Somebody dropped him in my league, just kind of, scrambling. You're going to get it. This is the point of the year where you're going to see a lot of desperate owners for a couple of reasons. One, they're either, 2-5, 3-4, and they feel like they can't wait for these guys they drafted that are underperforming. And second, you're going to get a lot of guys that are going to have bye week players, and they're going to get killed with a bye week. They might be 3-4 thinking, if I lose this game and go 3-5, I got a long road to hoe. So, look at the guy that's got C.J. Anderson. Maybe he's willing to give him up for pennies on the dollar. I mean, if you can get C.J. Anderson for a guy like, I don't know, Golden Tate or, someone of that nature, a wide receiver 3 or wide receiver, low wide receiver 2, high wide receiver 3, I think you should jump on that and maybe just pocket him, because there was no mistake. C.J. Anderson was the guy in Denver last year, and he came out slow this year, but he hasn't been completely healthy. And Ronnie Hillman's had maybe like 4 good games in his career. So those are guys that I'd look to maybe kind of not replace Arian Foster, but maybe supplement my running back depth in case one of them does sort of take off and give me something going into the playoff stretch.
Well, yeah, and what I would be targeting is a lot of these guys who are coming out of bye where – the owner probably only remembers the bad stuff, especially if they're in a bad situation like you were describing. You already mentioned Jeremy Hill. That's a good one, I think, especially as the weather gets colder and, they lean more on like the ground game. But, I like CJ Anderson to do a little bit more, like you said, especially coming out of the bye. One guy that I would definitely be targeting, if you have the trade value, I guess, is Eddie Lacy. I know Starks blew up, and they're kind of going back and forth between. I think they just alternate in Green Bay every drive or so which running back they're going to go to. So basically, if Starks is out there and they're on a good drive or whatever, and he does well that drive, then he's the one. But I think Lacy definitely has more ability, I guess. And I read a report that. Starks has some sort of injury that will slightly hobble him, and Lacy is fully recovered after the bye. So again, that's someone who's been disappointing that I would definitely try and target.
Yeah, and on top of that point, it might be good to try to wait till after this week, because I don't see him doing much against Denver. I could eat my words after this, but that defense is so good. And Lacy's been slow out of the gate. So maybe if this would be a good week to kind of feel out the Lacy owner, let him know you're interested, and then maybe next week if he puts up 20 carries for 42 yards, might be a good time to see what his offer, see where he stands then, because don't forget Green Bay's still got to play Detroit again. They still got to play Chicago again. There's a couple of teams in there, that they're going to be able to play that don't have the stout defenses that Denver does. And, this happens with Eddie Lacy, it seems like yearly. He really starts out very slowly. He seems to be a guy the first 6 or 7 weeks isn't doing much. But near the end of the year, like Jeremy Hill, once the weather gets cold, he becomes a bruising running back. And I think he thrives on contact. And once it gets cold and guys don't want to hit so much, that's where he seems to really shine. So in Green Bay, once the tundra freezes, I think he's the guy that you're going to want on your team.
Well, and about trading for him this week over next week, you're definitely right in terms of the Denver. I don't expect him to do too much against Denver. Again, could be wrong on that. But my thought in terms of trade value is I'm looking at guys who have been disappointing, and the thing that would make me want to try and go after him this week over next week is those stupid ESPN projections. Depending on who has them on their team, if they're fantasy knowledgeable, they may want to hang on to Lacy anyway because he's past his bye, and they may see the potential as well. But I mean, somebody who doesn't know every single player and why they're doing poorly and all that kind of stuff, I mean, they're likely just looking at the projections. And his projection this week is only 7.1 in ESPN standard, 9.9 in PPR. That to me, the owner would think, all right, I'm going to get more of the same going forward. Whereas after next week, their matchups improve and he starts looking a little bit better by just the projections. But
so let me ask you, if you had Eddie Lacy, what would you take? What would it take to get him away from you? All things equal, let's say your running backs are run of the mill, sort of. You got Eddie Lacy, you've got a guy like Justin Forsett, and maybe on the bench you've got a guy like Frank Gore. If I come to you, what does it take to get a guy like Eddie Lacy? Do you take a guy like Jeremy Maclin? Do you need more than that as a receiver? What are you looking at? What do you think his value is at this point in the season?
Well, there's so many factors that would go into it. Currently, I've got one team that is it's basically at the top of the league in a 14-team league, and if I have Eddie Lacy in that situation, I'm hanging on to him, especially if I have a guy like Gore where I can plug him into the RB2 slot. And then if I have a good wide receiver, I could plug, a wide receiver in the flex over another running back. But I personally see a lot of value in Eddie Lacy going forward. So it's going to take a lot, probably RB1 value, even though he hasn't been putting up those numbers. I might trade him for...
If you needed a receiver, I guess...
Yeah, I could see Maclin, especially in PPR. Wide receiver wise, again, I personally would be looking at a wide receiver one to get him. But if I'm trying to throw someone out there, I'm definitely looking more in the wide receiver 2 range, RB2 range, somebody who has comparable stats to him right now, because I think he's going to play better than the stats.
Yeah,
show.
I think Eddie Lacy's value is probably straight up AJ Green. I think
yeah.
I would trade. Those two guys have both been disappointing. Andy Dalton's falling in love with Tyler Eifert and Giovanni Bernard. The potential is there, but they've just underperformed. So if you can, I think that's kind of, if I'm looking to trade Eddie Lacy, I'm looking for someone that's kind of that ilk of AJ Green, a guy that we know at the top of his game, he's one of the best, but he just hasn't shown it that much this year. So, I think that would be. If you can get Eddie Lacy and you lost Arian Foster, I think that would be huge for your team. Again, I don't know if you want to sacrifice, I don't want to, if you want to cut off your nose to spite your face, but that's a guy that, players like that have underperformed, might be someone to kind of target in a league where you think you're right on the cusp and you just happen to lose Arian Foster.
Let's wrap up here with the running backs with this last scenario here. I really want to know what you think of Detroit's running back situation going forward. They just fired their offensive coordinator and O-line coach. Do you think that the running back situation is going to improve there? And who do you think is going to kind of emerge out of that dumpster fire of who they have?
Well, it's going to be tough. If Amir Abdullah didn't fumble, I think he would be a guy that you want to target. I really think he's got a little Reggie Bush in him. He's kind of elusive. Reggie Bush thrived in Detroit for a time. Just because in space, when he operates in space, he's very, very good. I think maybe Amir Abdullah's a guy to keep my eye on. I kind of don't think anything of Joique Bell just because he's older, he's injured. I don't know if he's coming back. I think Theo Riddick is a guy that might actually be someone that isn't terrible. if when that offense is clicking, unfortunately, it's when Matthew Stafford is throwing the ball a lot. And, the O-line isn't what it was last year. They can't keep Stafford upright. And the offense that Lombardi was running was just, it almost seemed like it was ignoring Calvin Johnson. And it was very, very disjointed. It didn't seem like anybody was really comfortable running it. So if I'm looking to buy low on Amir Abdullah just because I think I could stash him and kind of see what happens. I think he stands to gain the most with the offensive coordinator change. He did sort of seem like he became a scapegoat with the fumbles, which again are inexcusable. But he's obviously, in my opinion, the most talented back in Detroit. So I look at Amir Abdullah and I look at Theo Riddick as a guy in PPR to kind of be like a Shane Vereen role that's in New England and New York. Not going to be a guy that's going to get you a lot of ground yards, but he's going to be a guy that's going to catch maybe 5 or 6 passes a game and maybe get like 50, 60 yards.
Yeah, I honestly don't know what to expect out of them at all. I think all these backs, even Bell, I mean, they have potential, but it's really going to depend on what these changes or how these changes affect the O-line. If they could really get some lanes opened up, I think Bell could even be a back that they could use just like straight up the middle. But
yeah, good goal line guy.
Yeah, but I feel like Detroit thinks that they have the talent on the O-line. They just weren't coached properly. So, I mean, if that's true, you could see like a Miami situation, although Miami's a little bit different in that, they just weren't using their running backs. Detroit's been using their running backs, and the running backs just haven't been producing. So I think that's something to keep your eye on. I wouldn't know myself who to pick up out of that. So if you can wait and see, that'd be great. If you have one of these guys, I say keep them because they do have a soft schedule for the rest of the season. But it'll be interesting to see. Is all I can say about that.
We saw Miami sort of come out barn burners after they fired Philbin and replaced him with Campbell. But I think people are quick to forget that Miami was a very, very highly touted team in the preseason because they had so much talent, and that talent just wasn't performing. I think with Detroit, there's kind of a lack of talent. We've kind of seen Calvin Johnson revert back to form, but he's older. He's going to be 30, and he seems like he's always battling injuries, and Golden Tate's kind of disappeared. So, they seemed, when they were running a vertical offense, it seemed like it was successful. I really thought last year the offense was successful, maybe not for fantasy, but it seemed like it clicked more and I know a lot of fans were hoping with the firing of Lombardi that maybe Caldwell would take over play calling duties. That didn't happen. So it's a very unpredictable scenario to find themselves in. And yeah, I mean, if you put me against the wall with a gun to my head and asked me to choose one, I would probably take Amir Abdullah just because I could stash him for a few weeks. If you have someone in your league, again, that's, in panic mode, you can maybe get Amir Abdullah for, I don't know. I don't know what his going value is, but it can't be that high. Maybe a tight end, maybe a high tight end too. I mean, maybe you could flip Jordan Cameron for Amir Abdullah if the guy that has Amir Abdullah has 0 tight end depth. But, he's a guy that I think a lot of people are – he's in that category of players that they're too good to cut, but they're not performing, so you can't get rid of them. Like Jeremy Hill. Jeremy Hill's a guy that – you took the name off his jersey. I don't know how many people would own him, but the fact that, we've seen what he's done, you don't want to get rid of him. So I think the talent with Amir Abdullah is there. It's just is he ever going to find what he needs to kind of, to translate into being an NFL back? And I think a large part of that is learning how to hold on to the football.
Exactly. Well, Nick, I guess let's get into the deep sleepers for week 8. After your great Amendola pick, I'm going to defer to you and make you pick first because I don't even know who I'm going to pick yet.
All right, I've got 2. For a running back, I've got Antonio Andrews. He's a guy that maybe for a week or two, like you said, I know they want to establish a bell cow in Tennessee, but Antonio Andrews, David Cobb's not going to be back until week 9, so Antonio Andrews is going to be the guy. He carried the ball 10 times for 57 yards last week against, to my surprise, the number 1 ranked rush defense in the NFL, which was the Falcons. I did not know they were the number 1 rush defense. I don't know if that stat is slightly misleading, but yeah, they are the number 1 rush defense. So against Houston is the worst rush defense in the entire league. Now, if you told me at the beginning of the year that a defense with J.J. Watt, Jadeveon Clowney, Brian Cushing were going to be the worst, I probably would have said you're crazy. But as it stands, they are historically bad. And I think if Antonio Andrews is sitting on your waiver wire, he might be a guy that you want to pick up and plug in this week because the Tennessee O-line isn't as bad as I think a lot of people think it is. And this could be the week that if Antonio Andrew knows Cobb is lingering around the corner, he really wants to establish himself. So, I could see them giving it to him 17 to 20 times. And against Houston, a team that's lost Arian Foster, just cut Ryan Mallett, the morale's got to be low. I could see them mailing it in this game, and I could really see Antonio Andrews running amok on them. And my other sleeper, we talked about the Lions a bit today. I really think with the coordinator change, Golden Tate is going to be a guy that might be worth keeping an eye on and maybe even plugging in if you're in a bye week conundrum. He's going against the Kansas City secondary that's not very good. We saw last week Martavis Bryant put up some big numbers against them, and we saw Antonio Brown have a decent game. Teams with two or better receivers, both the receivers tend to feast on this Kansas City secondary. So Golden Tate is a guy that I think the Lions really need to get back into the offense and establish him if they want to have success. Last year when they were moving the ball, it was a lot because of Golden Tate moving the chains, making big plays, getting open downfield. So those are my two sleepers. I think Antonio Andrews and Golden Tate are two guys to maybe keep your eye on. If you have them, consider playing them. If you don't have them on the waiver wire, I would see if there's anyone you could drop to get them. And in all likelihood, if they're claimed in your league, but someone's not starting them, see if there's someone of their, see if there's someone that's underperforming that you can maybe offload for these guys. Because I think, rest of schedule, I like Golden Tate because I do think Antonio Andrews has a uphill battle. But if Antonio Andrews is on the waiver wire, he's certainly a guy I would pick up and maybe play this week against the woeful Houston defense.
Yeah, to follow up with what you were saying, I think the Atlanta defense might be, and I haven't looked at the numbers, just that I've been watching the games obviously, but I think Atlanta has the number one rush defense just because teams have been playing. They're passing so well against the Falcons, so they may just not be running the ball. The Falcons have been in some close ones, but there have been some blowouts like the Texans where it's like I didn't expect them to get anything going anyway. In terms of Golden Tate, man, that is a very risky play, but I look forward to seeing it just with how much they're in transition right now with the coaching change and all that. Also with I think Stafford had a hand injury, right?
Yeah, he did. He had something last week. I forget what it was. I don't know if it was on a play where he was sacked, but yeah, he was. I don't know if he just got like a stinger where his hand fell asleep or what it was. I think reports are saying he'll play, and that's that game in London. So those are always kind of weird, oddball things happen overseas. So, I mean...
Well, and I think there's a stat saying that teams run the ball more often and when they play those overseas games. Mm-hmm. But, who knows? I think it's definitely it's a good pick, but it's also pretty risky with all the things that are going on.
Right.
So for my picks, I went... Well... Really, I have four guys here, but I'll narrow it down to two. I have Charles Sims. I don't know if he's going to be available in a lot of leagues. Like I said, I'm in like a 14-team league, so he's well into somebody's team already. But if he's out there or you have him, I think he's a good play against Atlanta. With Martin playing, on the ground, Sims has been really good in PPR, and I think that teams will do well against my Falcons. In terms of just the passing running backs, Sproles just like absolutely destroyed us when we played the Eagles. I think that's a weakness of our team there are the passing running backs. So that's someone to look at. I was considering both Chris Polk and Alfred Blue. Everything we said before still stands, but just the matchup with Tennessee, they haven't been doing well against the run. So I think that's those are two guys that you probably tried to get this week already on waivers anyway. So you might as well play them now while they have some value and then maybe trade them the week after. But
yeah.
For wide receivers, I had Corey Brown. You're probably wondering who that is even. It's the number 2 wide receiver in depth chart position only on Carolina. Again, this is a guy playing Indy like I thought Snead would excel against. He's the number 2, so he's not drawing that Vontae Davis coverage that I think Ted Ginn will probably get.
Yeah, or even Greg Olson.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they can contain Greg Olson, I'm pretty sure Indy could, at least give something up to Corey Brown. Again, not somebody that you've probably even heard of this year yet, but I think this will be the week that he'll have a good week. I wouldn't keep him or anything, but
yeah, bye week fill in.
Exactly. And also on my list, again, this isn't a sleeper pick, but I was looking at the St. Louis wide receivers just because they're playing San Francisco. Kenny Britt kind of jumped out to me just because of the matchup for quarterback, but man, it's just so risky playing any St. Louis wide receiver. I think their offensive coordinator is just going to give the ball to Gurley every single play until maybe he gets stopped on like 2 or 3 in a row. But
yeah, and then just give it back to him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a tough one. I couldn't commit fully to that one, but if you have a St. Louis wide receiver and you've been debating about picking them over someone else, Foles isn't that bad. It's just a matter of opportunity in terms of like I said, they're going to be running the ball like crazy. So
yeah, that offense, I mean, for as good as that defense is, that offense is such a mess to watch on TV. Like, outside of Gurley, I don't know what they're doing. I watched a couple of series last week against the Browns, who have a terrible defense, and I mean, Foles looked like he was lost. It was ugly. I think, it seems like they're always going to try to get Tavon Austin a couple of gadget plays, and they're just going to pound the rock with Gurley. But, of that receiving core, Kenny Britt's the one that has the most success. So, I mean, I don't think that's a terrible pick at all.
Well, and man, I really want to know, where is Brian Quick? I mean, what are they doing with him? I don't get it. I think at this point you got to put him on a milk carton in St. Louis and have someone call in and tell you where he's been, because I don't know why they're not playing him. I don't know why he's not getting the targets. I really just have no idea what's going on. I mean, obviously he had a big flash last year, and previous to that he wasn't much. So maybe that's what they're seeing in practice. But I really expected to see him, come of his own, because there's no wide receiver on that squad where I'm like shaking in my boots about yet.
Right.
Other than, like I said, if Brian Quick could come out there for a game and actually get some targets, they might actually have some production in terms of the pass game. But anyway.
Yeah, they play San Francisco, not a good defense. So, I mean, if there's a good, but I thought the same with Cleveland. But we knew Cleveland's run defense was abysmal. I think their pass defense is a little underrated. And, I know they've been missing Joe Hayden and, a couple of Tayshaun Gibson in their secondary. But, yeah, I think, against San Francisco, I think the Rams should be able to open up the offense a little bit.
Well, Nick, that's our time for the Flex Podcast. If you like what you heard, give us a favorite, a like, and leave comments on our YouTube page, or hit us up on Twitter at the Flex Podcast. Thanks again, and see you next week.
See you later, guys.